Sometimes the camera is pointed in exactly the right direction for exactly the wrong reason. A bridge begins to twist. The ocean suddenly disappears. A routine launch changes in 73 seconds. And people filming an ordinary fire have no idea what's racing toward them. These aren't recreations. They aren't movie scenes. They're real moments caught on camera. Seconds before nobody knew what was coming. Here are 10 real moments nobody saw coming. Number 10. The Chelyabinsk meteor. At first, the people holding the cameras weren't filming a disaster. They were driving to work. On the morning of February 15, 2013, traffic was moving normally through Chelyabinsk, Russia. Dashcams stared through windshields at frozen roads, intersections, and an ordinary winter sky. Then, something appeared above the city. A streak of light crossed the horizon. It grew brighter and brighter. For a few seconds, it became so intense that the sky seemed to have gained a second sun. Then it disappeared. And, strangely, nothing happened. Not yet. What the people watching didn't realize was that a roughly 18-meter-wide space rock had entered the atmosphere at about 18.6 kilometers per second and exploded high above the region. Light reached them almost immediately. The shock wave did not. That delay created one of the most unsettling parts of the footage. People had time to stop, look toward the sky, walk toward windows, and wonder what they had just seen. Then the pressure wave arrived. Glass exploded inward. Buildings shook. Car alarms erupted across the city. More than 1,500 people were injured, while thousands of buildings were damaged. Many injuries caused not by falling meteor fragments, but by the blast wave and shattered glass. But perhaps the strangest detail came later. This wasn't an asteroid astronomers had been tracking toward Earth. It approached from roughly the direction of the Sun, making it extraordinarily difficult for ground-based telescopes to detect beforehand. The cameras were already recording. The city was already awake, but almost no one looking at that brilliant sky knew that the most dangerous part hadn't reached them yet. And at least Chelyabinsk gave people a few seconds between the flash and the impact. Our next moment gave almost no warning at all. Number 9. The Tacoma Narrows bridge collapse. For months, people had watched this bridge move in the wind. Some even came just to see it happen. But on November 7, 1940, the movement changed. The Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington had opened only a few months earlier. Its long, narrow deck was unusually flexible, and motorists had already given it a nickname, Galloping Gertie. That morning, strong winds swept through the Narrows. At first, the bridge did what it had done before. It rose, it fell. Long waves traveled across the roadway. Professor F.B. Farquharson of the University of Washington was already there studying the motion, and his team began filming it. Then, shortly after 10 a.m., something changed. The familiar up-and-down movement transformed into something far more violent. The roadway began twisting. One side rose while the other dropped. Then they reversed. Again. And again. From a distance, the bridge no longer looked like a solid structure. It looked almost flexible enough to be made of fabric. And the camera kept rolling. The twisting grew so extreme that sections of the roadway were thrown through enormous angles as aerodynamic forces fed energy back into the structure. The bridge's excessive flexibility and vulnerability to those forces would later become central to understanding its failure. Then, pieces began falling. Concrete broke away. Sections of the deck dropped into Puget Sound. And at around 11 a.m., the central span finally gave way. A bridge that had been considered one of the great engineering achievements of its era disappeared into the water. Remarkably, no people were killed, but there was one fatality. A dog named Tubby had been trapped inside an abandoned car on the bridge and went down with the collapsing roadway. And that's what makes the footage so extraordinary. The men behind the cameras weren't waiting to film one of the most famous bridge collapses in history. They were documenting a vibration problem. They had no way of knowing that the engineering experiment unfolding in front of them was about to become the disaster that would change how future suspension bridges were studied. After Tacoma, wind was no longer something bridge designers could treat simply as a force pushing against a structure. Aerodynamics had become part of the structure itself, but at least this disaster unfolded slowly enough for cameras to keep watching. The next one would go from a routine arrival to catastrophe in less than a minute. Number 8. The Hindenburg disaster. The cameras were there to record an arrival. Instead, they captured the end of an era. On May 6, 1937, the German airship Hindenburg reached Lakehurst, New Jersey, after crossing the Atlantic from Frankfurt. It was enormous, more than 800 feet long, and for the passengers aboard, the difficult part of the journey was essentially over. Bad weather had delayed the arrival, but by evening, the storm had passed. The airship circled the field. Its engines slowed. Ground crews moved into position. Landing ropes dropped from the nose. Everything now looked routine. Then, at approximately 7:25 p.m., someone saw fire near the rear of the ship. There was almost no time to react. Flames spread through the Hindenburg with astonishing speed. The stern began falling, the nose tilted upward. Passengers and crew suddenly found themselves trapped inside a burning structure still suspended above the ground. And the cameras kept filming. Within roughly 34 seconds, the enormous airship was on the ground, its fabric covering destroyed and its metal framework surrounded by fire. What makes the footage even more disturbing is how ordinary the scene looked only moments earlier. The people filming weren't waiting for an accident. Reporter Herb Morrison and sound engineer Charles Nielsen had been sent there to document the Hindenburg's arrival. Morrison began with the controlled voice of a reporter describing a landing. Then the fire appeared, and his recorded reaction became one of the most famous eyewitness broadcasts in radio history. There were 97 passengers and crew aboard. 35 of them died, along with one member of the ground crew. Yet 62 people aboard survived, a remarkable number considering how quickly the ship was consumed. But there's another detail the famous footage can make easy to forget. It doesn't actually show the exact instant the fire began. The surviving film cameras captured the disaster only after flames had already appeared, which means one of history's most photographed catastrophes still left its first critical seconds largely unseen. Investigators would spend years debating exactly how the fire started, but for the people standing beneath the Hindenburg, none of that mattered in that moment. Seconds earlier, they were preparing to pull a luxury passenger airship safely toward its mooring mast. Then the sky caught fire, and in less than a minute, one of the great symbols of commercial airship travel was effectively finished. But the next disaster didn't begin above an airfield. It began when part of an entire mountain suddenly moved. Number 7. Mount St. Helens erupts sideways. Everyone knew Mount St. Helens was dangerous. What almost nobody expected was which direction the explosion would go. By May 1980, the volcano in Washington had been restless for weeks. Thousands of earthquakes had shaken the mountain. Steam explosions had opened its summit, and the entire northern side was visibly swelling outward. Scientists were watching closely. But on the morning of May 18th, the monitoring data showed no extraordinary change that clearly warned of what was about to happen. Then, at 8:32 a.m., a magnitude 5.1 earthquake struck beneath the volcano, and the mountain began to move. The swollen northern flank suddenly collapsed, Not a small section. An enormous portion of Mount St. Helens slid away in what the USGS describes as the largest landslide in recorded history. For a few seconds, that collapse was the disaster. Then it exposed something far worse. Inside the mountain was a mass of extremely hot, pressurized magma. When the landslide removed the rock holding that pressure in place, the volcanic system depressurized almost instantly. And instead of sending its first devastating blast straight upward, Mount St. Helens exploded sideways. A wall of superheated gas, ash, and shattered rock accelerated northward at least 300 miles per hour. Forests didn't simply burn. Entire stands of trees were flattened in the same direction as the blast raced across the landscape. The devastation reached nearly 19 miles from west to east, and more than 12 miles north of the former summit. Within the inner zone, virtually no trees remained standing. And then came the image most people associate with a volcanic eruption. A gigantic column began climbing into the sky. Within less than 15 minutes, it had risen more than 15 miles above the volcano. But by then, the most unexpected part had already happened. The mountain had not simply erupted from its summit. Part of the mountain had disappeared first, removing the barrier that was holding the eruption back. 57 people were killed, including USGS volcanologist David Johnston, who had been monitoring the volcano from an observation post north of the summit. That's what makes the footage and photographs from that morning so extraordinary. People had been watching Mount St. Helens precisely because they knew it might erupt. They expected danger. They expected an explosion. What they didn't fully anticipate was that the mountain itself would collapse and turn the side of the volcano into the path of the blast. But our next moment began with something much quieter: water simply disappearing from a beach. Number 6. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami. At first, it didn't look like a wave was coming. It looked like the ocean was leaving. On the morning of December 26, 2004, people along beaches across the Indian Ocean noticed something deeply unusual. The water began pulling away from the shoreline, farther than normal. In some places, the seabed was suddenly exposed. Fish were left behind. Boats settled onto wet sand. And instead of running inland, some people walked toward the retreating water to see what had happened. They had no idea that the ocean was giving them a warning. Minutes earlier, a massive undersea earthquake had ruptured the sea floor off northern Sumatra. The sudden movement displaced an enormous volume of seawater and sent tsunami waves racing outward across the Indian Ocean. But a tsunami doesn't always arrive as a towering wall of water. Sometimes the first visible sign is the opposite. The sea withdraws. And that is exactly what made the moment so dangerous. People saw empty beach where water had been only minutes before. Some began taking photographs. Others walked out onto the newly exposed seabed. Then the horizon changed. A line of white water appeared in the distance. At first, it didn't seem especially large. Then it kept growing. The water returned with extraordinary force. It crossed beaches, hit buildings, lifted cars, carried boats far inland. And in many places, the first wave was not the last. More water followed, sometimes larger, sometimes arriving after people believed the danger had already passed. The disaster ultimately affected coastlines across multiple countries and became one of the deadliest tsunamis in recorded history. But the detail that makes the surviving footage so unsettling is what happens before the destruction. There is often no panic. People are still standing, watching, trying to understand why the sea has disappeared. Some are even walking toward it. And that's what makes this moment different from so many disasters. The warning was visible, but almost nobody on those beaches understood what it meant. By the time the ocean revealed the answer, there was almost nowhere left to run. And our next moment was even more deceptive, because millions of people were watching live when everything suddenly went wrong. Number 5. The Space Shuttle Challenger disaster. For the first 72 seconds, nothing looked wrong. Challenger climbed cleanly into the Florida sky. Then, 1 second later, everything changed. On January 28, 1986, Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from Kennedy Space Center, carrying 7 crew members. Among them was Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher selected for NASA's Teacher in Space project. That made this launch different. Across America, classrooms were watching, families were watching. Television cameras were already pointed at the shuttle. At 11:38 a.m., Challenger left the pad. The ascent initially appeared normal. It completed its roll maneuver. The engines throttled down through maximum aerodynamic pressure. Then they powered back up. From the ground, it looked like another successful shuttle launch. But a failure had already begun. Shortly after ignition, hot gases started escaping through a joint in the right solid rocket booster. The sealing O-rings had been affected by the unusually cold conditions that morning. The temperature at launch was only about 36 degrees Fahrenheit, roughly 15 degrees colder than any previous shuttle launch. For more than a minute, Challenger continued climbing. Then the escaping flame damaged the nearby external tank structure. At approximately 73 seconds after liftoff, the vehicle began to come apart. To the people watching from the ground, it happened almost instantly. A bright flash, a massive cloud. Then 2 white trails separated and curved away in different directions. There was no obvious warning for the audience. One moment, Challenger was climbing toward orbit. The next, there was no shuttle. And the cameras never stopped rolling. All 7 crew members were lost. But the most disturbing part of the story had begun before Challenger ever left the ground. Engineers had raised concerns about how the cold could affect the booster O-rings. NASA's own historical account notes that those concerns were discussed before launch, but managers ultimately cleared the mission to proceed. That changes the way the footage feels. To millions of viewers, the disaster came without warning. But inside the launch decision process, the danger had already been discussed. The people watching television couldn't see it. The cameras couldn't see it. And for the first 72 seconds of flight, neither could anyone looking at Challenger. Then, in a single moment, one of the most watched launches in American history became one of NASA's greatest tragedies. But the next disaster didn't begin in the sky. It began when the ocean suddenly pulled away from the land. Number 4. The Beirut port explosion. At first, people weren't filming an explosion. They were filming a fire. On the evening of August 4th, 2020, smoke was rising from the port of Beirut. From balconies, rooftops, streets, and passing cars, phones turned toward the harbor. Then, small flashes began appearing inside the smoke. Something was clearly wrong, but almost nobody holding those cameras understood what they were about to witness. At approximately 6:08 p.m., the fire intensified. A first blast erupted from the warehouse area. A dense cloud expanded above the port. Windows rattled, people shouted, and many cameras kept recording. Then came the second explosion. For a fraction of a second, an enormous reddish cloud appeared above the port. Around it, a nearly perfect white condensation cloud expanded outward. Then, the shock wave reached the city. Windows shattered, balconies collapsed. Cars were thrown through streets. People filming from buildings hundreds of meters away were knocked backward as the pressure wave tore through Beirut. The explosion was linked to a huge quantity of ammonium nitrate that had been stored unsafely at the port for years. Shipping records show that 2,750 tons had originally arrived aboard the vessel Rosas. although investigators have disagreed over exactly how much remained in the warehouse when the final blast occurred. More than 200 people were killed, thousands were injured, and roughly 300,000 people were displaced from their homes. But one detail explains why so many videos of the disaster feel almost impossible to watch. The cameras were already pointed directly at the danger. People could see the smoke. They could see the fire. Some had even witnessed the smaller explosions. And yet none of those things revealed the true scale of what was sitting inside the port. For years, officials had been warned about the dangerous ammonium nitrate stored in Hangar 12. The people filming from their apartments knew none of that. To them, it was still a distant fire, until the shockwave arrived. And that's what makes these recordings so disturbing. In many of them, there is a brief moment after the massive blast becomes visible, but before the pressure wave reaches the person holding the camera. They can already see that something catastrophic has happened. They simply haven't felt it yet. Then the image shakes, the windows explode, and the camera falls. In seconds, an ordinary evening became a disaster that caused billions of dollars in physical damage across Beirut. But our next moment would be different. There was no burning warehouse to watch, no smoke in the distance. The warning came directly from the ground beneath people's feet. Number 3. The 2011 Japan tsunami. The shaking was terrifying. But the earthquake wasn't the part that would erase entire neighborhoods. On March 11, 2011, at 2:46 p.m., northeastern Japan was struck by the strongest earthquake ever recorded in the country. Buildings swayed, roads cracked. People struggled to remain standing. Japan's warning systems reacted quickly. Tsunami warnings began going out just minutes after the earthquake. And then, the shaking stopped. For many people near the coast, that should have been the moment of relief. Instead, the real disaster was still moving toward them. Offshore, the massive rupture had displaced the sea floor and pushed an enormous volume of water outward. The tsunami reached parts of Japan's coast within tens of minutes. From higher ground, cameras began recording. At first, what appeared offshore didn't always resemble the giant breaking wave people imagine when they hear the word tsunami. It looked more like the ocean itself was rising. Then the water crossed the shoreline. It entered harbors. It climbed over coastal defenses. And it simply kept moving. Cars began drifting, then boats, then entire buildings. In some of the most haunting footage, people can see the water advancing through streets while traffic is still moving only a short distance ahead of it. The scale becomes clear only gradually. What first looks like flooding becomes a moving field of debris. Homes collide with other homes. Vehicles disappear beneath black water. Fires burn while the current carries wreckage farther inland. Japan had spent decades preparing for earthquakes and tsunamis. There were seawalls, evacuation routes, warning systems, and communities with generations of experience living beside the Pacific. But this event exceeded many of the assumptions those defenses had been built around. The Japan Meteorological Agency eventually measured tsunami heights of at least 9.3 meters at Soma and 8.6 meters at Ishinomaki, with some instruments unable to capture the full height because they were overwhelmed. And that is what makes the footage so difficult to comprehend. The people filming knew a tsunami was possible. Some were already standing on high ground precisely because they had evacuated. Yet, even from safety, many could only watch as the water traveled farther inland than they expected. Past roads, past buildings, past defenses designed to stop it. The earthquake had given Japan a warning. What almost nobody could see coming was just how much larger the second disaster would become. But our next moment would unfold differently. This time, millions already knew they were witnessing catastrophe. What they didn't know was that the skyline itself was about to change. Number 2. The collapse of the Twin Towers. By the time the cameras were pointed at Manhattan, everyone already knew something terrible was happening. What almost nobody expected was that the buildings themselves would disappear. On the morning of September 11, 2001, television cameras across New York were already focused on the World Trade Center after American Airlines Flight 11 struck the North Tower. Then, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 hit the South Tower. Millions of people saw it happen live. At that point, there was no longer any doubt that the United States was under attack. Smoke poured from both towers. Flames were visible high above the streets. Emergency crews rushed toward the complex while thousands of people tried to escape. From a distance, the towers still looked impossibly solid. They had dominated the Manhattan skyline for decades. Each stood more than 1,300 feet tall, and despite the enormous damage, both structures remained standing. For a while. Then, at 9:59 a.m., something changed. The upper section of the South Tower began to move. It tilted. Then, the floors beneath it started disappearing into a rapidly expanding cloud of dust. In roughly 10 seconds, the entire tower collapsed. For people watching television, it was difficult to understand what they had just seen. One of the tallest buildings in the world was simply gone. And the cameras kept rolling. But the disaster wasn't finished. 29 minutes later, at 10:28 a.m., the North Tower also collapsed. The impacts had damaged structural columns and stripped away fireproofing. Fires then weakened parts of the building's steel structures until sections could no longer support the loads above them. Once collapse began, the enormous mass of the upper floors overwhelmed the structure below. But here's the detail that makes the footage especially haunting. Between the two collapses, there was a period when everyone watching the North Tower knew exactly what had just happened to its neighbor. Firefighters were still operating below. Cameras were still filming. People were still looking upward. And now there was a terrible new possibility that hadn't seemed real only minutes earlier. The second tower might fall too. Then it did. Nearly 3,000 people were killed in the attacks of September 11th. But the visual shock of that morning came from more than the destruction itself. Millions of people were watching a familiar skyline in real time and saw something they had never imagined possible. The attacks were already unimaginable. The collapse of the first tower changed the scale of the event. The collapse of the second made it clear that New York's skyline and American history had changed permanently. And yet our number one moment begins with something far less dramatic. No explosion, no fire, no collapsing skyscraper. Just the ground moving slightly beneath an entire country before the true scale of the event became visible. Number 1. The earthquake that moved Japan. At first, the cameras showed what Japan had seen many times before. Buildings swaying, ceiling lights swinging, people holding onto desks. Then scientists measured what had actually happened. The ground itself had moved by meters. On March 11, 2011, a massive earthquake struck beneath the Pacific Ocean off northeastern Japan. It began at 2:46 in the afternoon. Within minutes, shaking spread across an enormous section of the country. Japan had experienced powerful earthquakes before. Its buildings were engineered for them, its population trained for them. Its warning systems were among the most advanced in the world. But this wasn't an ordinary earthquake. It was magnitude 9.0, powerful enough to rupture roughly 300 kilometers of the plate boundary offshore. And while people above ground were watching buildings move, the landscape beneath them was undergoing something far more extraordinary. GPS stations across Japan began recording enormous displacement. On the Oshika Peninsula, one monitoring station shifted approximately 5.3 meters toward the east-southeast. It also sank by roughly 1.2 meters. Think about that. Not a car, not a building, a piece of Japan itself had changed position. And it happened within minutes. But offshore, the movement was even more consequential. The sudden displacement of the seafloor pushed an enormous volume of seawater upward. That energy became a tsunami. At first, there was almost nothing dramatic to see in the open Pacific. Tsunamis can travel across deep ocean at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, while remaining relatively low in height. Only when that energy reaches shallow coastal water does the wave begin to grow. Then the cameras along Japan's coast captured the transformation. Water entered harbors, crossed sea walls, filled streets. Cars began floating. Buildings broke loose. Entire neighborhoods seemed to start moving. In some locations, the tsunami traveled several miles inland. But here's why this belongs at number 1. The most astonishing part wasn't simply what people could see. It was what had happened underneath everything they were filming. In a matter of minutes, one geological event had moved sections of the Japanese landscape by meters, generated waves that crossed the entire Pacific, and forced surveyors to recalculate the positions of thousands of reference points because the old coordinates were no longer accurate. The footage shows roads shaking, buildings moving, and eventually an ocean coming inland. But none of those cameras could capture the true scale of what had just occurred. Because the biggest movement wasn't a building collapsing or a wave crossing a road. It was the Earth itself changing the map beneath their feet. And perhaps that's what connects every moment on this list. The camera may already be recording. People may already be watching. Everything may even look completely normal, until 1 second changes what everyone thought was possible. The strange thing about moments like these is that the warning often makes sense only afterward. A flash in the sky, water pulling away from shore, a bridge beginning to move, smoke rising in the distance. At the time, they can look almost ordinary. Then everything changes. And sometimes, the camera is the only reason we can go back and see the exact second when normal became history. If one of these moments surprised you more than the others, tell me which one in the comments. And if you enjoy real events, engineering, disasters, and moments that changed without warning, subscribe for the next documentary.